My wife drained our twins' college fund and vanished with her lover. I was devastated until my kids smirked and said, "Dad, don't worry. We've already handled it." Days later, she called screaming when she discovered. Before we go on, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. They emptied the account, the $240,000 that I had saved penny by penny for 11 years so my children could go to college. 11 years of overtime, of working weekends, of saying no to vacations, to new clothes, to anything that wasn't necessary. All gone in a single transfer. And Norma, my wife of 20 years, wasn't at home. Her clothes weren't there, her suitcase wasn't there, and her phone went straight to voicemail. I stood in the middle of the room with a bank statement in my hand, unable to breathe properly, feeling the floor move beneath my feet. It wasn't a bank error. It wasn't a misunderstanding. The money had been withdrawn in 3 different transfers, all on the same day, all to an account I had never seen in my life. And the last transfer had a time and date, 6:47 in the morning, just when I left for work. She waited for me to walk out the door to do it. I sat on the bed. I couldn't think clearly. I called Norma 20 times in a row, 20 times the same voicemail. Then I texted her, then I begged her by message. Nothing. Total silence. The kind of silence that isn't carelessness, but a decision. It was at that moment that I heard footsteps in the hallway. Damian and Adolfo entered the room. My twin sons, 18 years old, both tall, both with that serious face they inherited from me, and that sometimes scared me because it reminded me too much of myself when I was young and tried not to show what I felt. They both stopped at the door and looked at me. I had the phone in one hand, the bank statement in the other, and I guess my face said it all because neither of them asked what had happened. They just looked at me, and then both of them, at the same time, without saying a word, a smile appeared on their faces. It wasn't a smile of joy. It wasn't a mocking smile. It was something different. It was the kind of smile someone has when they know something you don't know yet. Calm, almost cold, as if what I was experiencing as the worst moment of my life was for them the beginning of something they had planned for a long time. Adolfo was the first to speak. "Dad," he said with a calmness that made no sense at that moment. "Don't worry about the money." I looked at him without understanding. "What do you mean, don't worry? Do you know what happened? Do you know where your mother is?" Damian nodded slowly, and that smile was still there, small, controlled, almost invisible. "We know exactly where she is," he said, "and we know who she's with." The air left my lungs. "We've already solved it, Dad. We just need you to trust us." And before I could say anything else, before I could ask what that meant, what they had done, what they knew, they both turned around and left the room with the same calmness they had entered with, as if they had just told me they were going down to buy milk. I was left alone with the bank statement, with the silence, with that phrase spinning in my head. We've already solved it. What had they solved? How? Since when did they know what I didn't know? They were my sons. They were 18 years old. What could 2 18-year-old boys have done against a woman who had just emptied a bank account and disappeared with a man I didn't even know existed yet? I had no idea what I was about to discover. And if I'm being honest with you right now, I also had no idea who my sons really were. I thought I knew them. I thought I knew everything about them, their friends, their classes, their fears, their dreams. But there are things that children hide, not out of malice, but because they're waiting for the exact moment when they need to use them. This was that moment. But to understand everything that happened next, to understand how 2 18-year-old boys accomplished what they accomplished, I have to take you back a few months. Because the story didn't start the day Norma emptied the account and disappeared. The story started much earlier in the small details I ignored, in the signs that were there right in front of my eyes and that I didn't want to see, because there are truths that hurt so much that the brain learns to look the other way. We have been married for 20 years, Norma and I. 20 years is not a short time. It's a whole life built together. It's 2 children, a house almost fully paid off, vacations that sometimes went well and sometimes ended in arguments, Christmas dinners with her family that I never fully understood. And that kind of routine that you sometimes mistake for happiness because no one is screaming and the dishes are washed and there's food on the table. I thought we were happy, or maybe I didn't think so, but it suited me to believe it because the alternative was to ask myself questions I didn't want to answer. I would tell myself when something didn't add up, "Are you tired? It's work. It's the years. This is what long marriages are like. This is normal." None of what was happening was normal. I know that now, and deep down I think I knew it then too. But a 45-year-old man who has spent 2 decades building something doesn't want to accept that what he built has deep cracks in the foundation, that the ground is rotten from the inside, that the person sleeping next to you every night for months, maybe years, is no longer thinking of you when she closes her eyes. Norma was 42 when all this happened. She was an intelligent woman. I always acknowledged that. Intelligent, organized, with an impressive memory for numbers. It was she who always handled the family finances. I earned the money, she managed it. That's how we operated from the beginning. I trusted her completely. I gave her access to all the accounts, to all the savings, to everything. I never checked a bank statement in 20 years because that's what she was for. That's what being a team was about, right? That's what I thought. What I didn't know was that trust, that blind faith I had in her, was exactly the weapon she was going to use to cause me the greatest harm of my life. I started noticing strange things around February. Little things. The kind of details that if you tell them to someone separately, they sound like nothing, but when you put them all together in your head, they suddenly form a picture that turned your stomach. Norma started going out more often. Before, it was me who sometimes came home late from work. Suddenly, it was her. Yoga classes that used to be on Tuesdays became Tuesdays and Thursdays. Then Saturday was added. Then she started coming home from those classes with damp hair, but without that particular smell that exercise leaves. She smelled of soap, of a different soap than the one in our house. I noticed it and said nothing. Her phone also changed. She had always kept it on the table when we were at home. Suddenly, she was carrying it in her pocket all the time. She took it to the bathroom with her, turned it off before sleeping. One night, I woke up at 3 in the morning and the bed was empty. I found her in the living room in the dark, typing silently. When she saw me, she flinched. She said she couldn't sleep. She put the phone away. We went back to bed and said nothing more. I didn't say anything either because saying it out loud would make it real. And I wasn't ready for it to be real. My sons were watching. Both of them in silence, from their rooms, from the breakfast table, from every corner of that house. Adolfo was always the more observant of the two. The kind of boy who seems to be in his own world, but who actually doesn't miss a thing. And Damian, his brother, was the strategist, the one who, when something worried him, didn't say it. He thought about it for days, and then came up with a complete plan, step by step, as if he were an architect, and the situation were a building that had to be redesigned from the foundations. They both knew before I did, long before, but they didn't tell me anything because they were doing something. Something I wouldn't discover until that Tuesday when I found the empty account and saw them smile with that calmness that I didn't understand at the time, and that days later would make me cry with pride and gratitude, and that kind of fatherly love that has no name, but is the strongest of all. Comment where you're watching from, because what comes next, what my sons did, what they discovered, and especially what happened when Norma called days later, desperate and screaming, is something you need to hear to the end. This is just the beginning. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in bed staring at the ceiling with my eyes open, listening to the silence of the house, as if at any moment that silence would give me an answer. The room still smelled of her perfume, of her night cream, of that particular mix that you learn to recognize after 20 years of sharing the same space with someone. And that smell that used to be familiar and reassuring to me, that night it turned my stomach. Norma was gone, not on vacation, not at her mother's house. She was really gone with a suitcase, with my children's money, with a man whose name I still didn't know, to a place I still didn't know, and she had planned it. That's what hit me the hardest. It hadn't been an impulse, a moment of madness, a decision made in the heat of a fight. It had been coldly calculated with dates, with bank transfers, with times chosen, so I wouldn't be at home when it all happened. She had studied me to hurt me with precision. I picked up the phone 3 times that night to call her. All 3 times I hung up before I finished dialing. What was I going to say to her? What was I going to ask her? Why? For what? People who do what she did don't have an answer that's enough. There's no explanation that can heal that. There are no words to fill that hole. At 2 in the morning, I got up and went to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water and stood in front of the window looking at the empty street. A streetlight was flickering half a block away. A dog was barking far off. The world kept spinning as if nothing had happened, completely indifferent to the fact that my life had just been split in two. It was then that I heard footsteps behind me. It was Adolfo in his pajamas, disheveled, with that look of not having slept that was exactly like mine. He stood next to me at the window and also looked at the street without saying anything for a moment. That's how my sons were. They never arrived in a hurry. They always let the silence do its part first. "Can't sleep?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. "I haven't slept well in weeks," he said, and at that moment something in the tone of his voice made me turn to look at him. He didn't say it like someone complaining about the heat or the noise. He said it like someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and can finally let it go a little. "Weeks," I repeated. Adolfo nodded, glanced at me, and then looked back at the street. "Dad, there are things you need to know. Many things. But tonight's not the time. Tonight you need to rest, even if it's just a little, because what's coming will require you to be whole." "What's coming?" I said. "What does that mean?" "It means this isn't over." He said, "It's just beginning, and we need you to be with us, not destroyed." I just stared at him. He was 18 years old. My son, the same one who at 6 would cry if his ice cream was taken away. The same one who at 12 was afraid to go to the doctor alone. The same one who last year asked me for advice on how to talk to a girl he liked. And now he was standing in front of me in the dark kitchen telling me to prepare myself for what was coming with a serenity that wasn't normal for his age, that wasn't normal for any age. "Since when have you known?" I asked him. He paused briefly. "For 4 months. For months." The number hit me like a bucket of ice water. 4 months knowing what I didn't know. 4 months watching me have breakfast with her, have dinner with her, live in the same house with her without saying anything. Not out of cruelty, I understood that later, but because they were building something, because telling me at that moment would have ruined what they had planned. "Get some sleep, Dad," Adolfo said. He put a hand on my shoulder, brief, firm, like a much older man would. "Tomorrow, Damian, and I will explain everything." I went back to bed. I didn't sleep, but I lay still. And at 7 in the morning, when the sun was already coming through the blinds and the house was starting to have that soft sound at the beginning of the day, they both appeared at my bedroom door. Damian was carrying 3 cups of coffee. Adolfo was carrying a folder, a thick folder of that hard cardboard type, with a rubber band holding it closed. They sat on the edge of the bed, one on each side of me, like when they were little and would get into our bed on Sunday mornings. Only now there was no playing or laughter. There was that folder, and there was something in both of their faces that told me that what I was about to hear was going to change everything I thought I knew about the last few years of my life. Damian was the first to speak. "It all started in January," he said. Adolfo noticed something strange on Mom's phone. I looked at Adolfo. He nodded. "It was by accident," he explained. "I was looking for the charger in her bag, because mine was broken and her phone was unlocked on the table. I wasn't looking for it, but the screen was on and I saw a message." "What did it say?" I asked. Adolfo looked down for a moment. It said, "Last night was amazing. I miss you already," with a heart. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that fills the entire space of a room. "Who sent it?" I said, though a part of me didn't want to know. "A contact saved as Jessica," Damian said, "but it wasn't any Jessica. It was a man. We confirmed it later." Adolfo opened the folder. Inside were printed sheets, screenshots, some handwritten notes, dates underlined with a red marker. They had organized it like a file, like something they had carefully built over months, layer by layer, detail by detail. "We didn't say anything to Mom about what we saw," Adolfo continued. "We decided to investigate first. We wanted to know who it was with, since when, and especially if there was anything else we didn't know." "And was there anything else?" I asked. They both looked at each other. That look, that fraction of a second in which they both consulted each other without words. That told me, before they even opened their mouths, that what was coming was worse than what I already knew. "Yes," Damian said. "There was much more." They explained that for the first few weeks, they only tracked the phone. Adolfo had installed, without Norman knowing, an app on his own phone that allowed him to see when she was active on certain networks. It wasn't illegal spying, he clarified. It was a tool they used to monitor activity on open networks. Damian had researched it, read the terms, made sure not to cross any lines. That's what he told me, and I believed him because that's how Damian was: meticulous, careful, the kind of person who reads the fine print before signing anything. What they found in those first few weeks was enough to confirm what they feared. Norma had a second account on a social network under a different name, a name that wasn't hers. From that account, she maintained conversations with a man named Marcelo, 40 years old. He lived in another city 3 hours from ours, divorced, no children. He worked in something related to imports, though my sons later discovered that that job was more irregular than it seemed. The conversations between Norma and Marcelo had been going on for at least 8 months. 8 months. When Damian told me that number, I had to get up from the bed and walk to the bathroom because I felt like I was going to throw up. 8 months, Christmas, my birthday, the anniversary we celebrated at that restaurant she liked so much, where she held my hand on the table and told me she was happy. All of that had happened while she had that man on her phone, while she was kissing me at night and writing messages in the early morning in the living room, thinking I was asleep. I splashed my face with cold water. I went back to the room. They were both still there waiting with a patience that broke my heart, because it was the patience of 2 sons who had decided to protect their father even before their father knew he needed protection. "There's more," Adolfo said when I sat down again. Not as a question, as a warning. "Tell me," I said. "The money," Damian said. "The college account wasn't the only one." I froze. "What do you mean it wasn't the only one?" Damian took one of the sheets from the folder and passed it to me. It was a list: dates, amounts, account names. I looked at it without fully processing what my eyes were seeing. There were movements that had been going on for more than a year, small at first. 200 pesos here, 500 there, the kind of transfers that don't attract attention if you're not looking carefully. And I never looked because I trusted, but the amounts had been growing, and in the last 3 months before the escape they had skyrocketed. "How much in total?" I asked. Damian took a second before answering. "Counting everything," he said, "including the college account and the previous movements we were able to trace. About 380,000 pesos, Dad." The number crushed me. 380,000 pesos. It wasn't just my son's future. It was a huge part of our entire security. Money I had earned with years of work, of sacrifice, of giving things up. Money she had been taking out in silence, drop by drop at first, and then by the bucketful while I kept getting up every morning to work, believing I was building something for our family. I wasn't building anything, or rather I was building, but not for us, for her other life, for Marcelo. I was silent for a long time. Adolfo and Damian didn't say anything. They were just there on either side of me, like 2 columns holding up something that was about to collapse. I finally looked up and looked at them. "You said you already solved it." I said. "What does that mean exactly?" They both looked at each other again, and for the first time since all this had started, Damian smiled for real. Not that small, enigmatic smile from the night before, a real smile. The smile of someone who has been working on something for months and can finally show what they've done. "It means," he said, "that while Mom thought she was getting away with everything, we had already gotten ahead of her. And at that moment, I understood that the story I thought was the worst of my life was about to become something completely different. But I still didn't know how. I still didn't know what they had done. I still didn't know what Marcelo really was, or what Norma was going to discover when she arrived at that place she thought she was fleeing to start over. That would come later. First, I had to understand how far the betrayal went, because what Damian and Adolfo showed me that morning with that folder on the bed and the coffee getting cold in the cups was only the first layer, and under that layer was another, and under that another one. Like a wound that when you open it you discover it's deeper than you thought, and deeper still. That morning with the folder open on the bed and the cold coffee in my hands, my son showed me something no father should ever have to see. It wasn't just the betrayal of a wife. It was the complete architecture of a lie built over years. Brick by brick, with patience, with intelligence, with a coldness I would never have associated with the woman I shared my bed with for 2 decades. Damian took another sheet from the folder. It was a handmade timeline with marked dates, with arrows connecting events. He had drawn it. I recognized it by the handwriting, by the order, by his way of organizing information as if he were an engineer designing a blueprint. From January to the day before, every important move of Norma's was recorded there, every suspicious outing, every transfer, every moment her behavior had changed in a way they considered relevant. For months of silent observation, for months in which my sons had breakfast with her, said good night to her, answered her questions about school and exams and all that time they knew. They kept that weight to themselves, between the two of them, without telling anyone, protecting me from a truth I wasn't ready to receive yet. That's what hurt me the most. Not the money, not Norma's betrayal, but imagining my two sons carrying that secret together, looking at me every night and choosing not to tell me anything, because they knew that telling me too soon would ruin what they were building. How did you stand it? I asked them. Adolfo shrugged with his usual calmness. We had each other, he said simply, and didn't add anything else because he didn't have to. Damian pointed to the timeline and began to explain. January, when Adolfo saw the message by accident, they both decided not to react immediately. That was key, he told me. The impulsive reaction would have been to confront her, or to tell me, or do something that would alert Norma that they knew. But Damian proposed something else. He proposed to observe, to document, to fully understand the situation before moving a single piece. In February, they started tracking the money movements. Adolfo had access to the family computer because Norma had never changed the password to the shared profile. An oversight, or perhaps arrogance. The conviction that no one in that house was watching closely enough. Within that profile, they found the saved access to one of the bank accounts, not all of them, but one, and with that one it was enough to see the pattern. The small withdrawals that had started months before, the increasing frequency, the amounts that were going up without any logical reason for the normal household expenses. Damian tabulated them all in a spreadsheet, date, amount, destination account, column by column, with the precision of someone who understands that numbers don't lie, even if people do. In March, they took the next step. They needed to know who Marcelo really was. The name was easy to find once they had his social media profile, but public profiles don't tell the whole story. Damian searched for his full name, his city, his work activity. What he found raised more questions than answers. Marcelo had a registered company that had been fiscally inactive for 2 years. He had debts, not serious, but they existed, and he had a history of short relationships with women that always ended the same way. The women lost something. Money in most cases, not a lot in each case, but it was a pattern. Damian saw it immediately because Damian sees patterns where others see coincidences. Marcelo wasn't in love with Mom. He told me that morning with a coldness that chilled my blood. Marcelo was using her. I just stared at him. How do you know that? Because I found 2 women before her. I contacted one. He paused. I pretended to be a student doing research on romance scams. She talked. She told me everything. The same story. The same charming man. The same promises of a new life. And in the end, the money that disappeared along with him. My stomach churned. Norma wasn't running away with the love of her life. Norma was falling into a trap he had seen work before with other women, and that was now closing in on her while she thought she was free. I felt something strange at that moment, something I didn't expect to feel. It wasn't satisfaction, not yet. It was a confusing mix of anger and something like pity. Not the kind of pity that softens you, but that cold pity you feel when someone very intelligent does something very stupid because they stop thinking with their head. Norma was intelligent. She always was, but Marcelo was more patient, and patience, when used to cause harm, is more dangerous than intelligence. Does she know what he is? I asked. No, Adolfo said. Not yet. Those 2 words. Not yet. Loaded with everything that was to come. Damian continued. In April, the month before the escape, the money movements accelerated. Norma started emptying accounts with more urgency. That told my sons that the departure date was near, that her and Marcelo's plan was entering its final phase. They had little time. It was then that Damian activated what he called the second stage. He explained that during those weeks, he had secretly consulted with a lawyer, a friend of a classmate's father who practiced family and financial law. He had explained the situation without giving names, just the facts, the transfers, the amounts, the college account, the pattern of systematic draining of family savings. The lawyer told him something very important. He told him that if they could document everything before Norma left the country, there were legal mechanisms to freeze assets and recover part of what was stolen. But time was critical. Once the money left certain accounts and moved to certain destinations, recovering it became exponentially more difficult. They needed to act before she left. The problem was they didn't know the exact date. Adolfo solved that. One afternoon the week before, while Norma was in the shower, Adolfo went into the kitchen where she had left her purse. He looked for the charger again like that first time. Only this time it wasn't by accident. This time he knew exactly what he was looking for. He took the phone. It was locked, but he knew the unlock pattern because months ago, he had seen her unlock it without her noticing he was watching. A small detail stored in his memory like a seed waiting for the moment to be used. He unlocked the phone. He had less than 3 minutes before she got out of the shower. In those 3 minutes, he found what he needed. A conversation with Marcelo where they confirmed the date. The following Tuesday, early in the morning, to take advantage of me leaving for work. The initial destination, a city 4 hours away, where Marcelo had contacts and where they had rented an apartment paid for in advance with part of the money Norma had been taking out for months. Adolfo memorized everything he could. He put the phone back exactly where it was. He left the kitchen before Norma finished drying off. And that night, while the three of us were having dinner together at that table, as if nothing was wrong, while Norma was asking us how our day had been, and I was replying with the same automatic normalcy, as always, Adolfo sent Damian a message under the table. The message said, "Tuesday, I know everything." Damian showed me that message on his phone. It was still saved. The time marked 9:47 p.m. While we were having dinner, while I was passing the bread to the woman who was betraying me without my knowledge, I had to close my eyes for a moment. I breathed. "And what did you do with that information?" I asked when I could speak again. Damian closed the folder slowly. "We called the lawyer the next day," he said, "and we set in motion what we had prepared." He looked me straight in the eyes. "Dad, by the time Mom transferred that money on Tuesday morning, there were things in motion that she didn't know about, things that are going to make that money useless to her, things that are going to make it so Marcelo can't touch it either." The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. It wasn't the silence of pain. It was the silence that comes just before something changes. "There's more I need to tell you," Adolfo said, "about Marcelo, about what we found in his accounts, and about a person he doesn't know we know about." I sat up in bed. The coffee was completely cold. The morning was advancing outside, and I was sitting between my two 18-year-old sons, slowly realizing that while I had spent 20 years believing I was protecting my family, they had spent 4 months protecting me, and they weren't done yet. What Adolfo told me next was what finally brought down the last wall I still had standing. Until that moment, as painful as everything was, I still had a version of Norma in my head that was human, confused, selfish, cruel in her decisions, but human. Someone who had made bad decisions for reasons I might one day be able to understand, though never forgive. A woman who had fallen in love with another man and had chosen the wrong way to get out of her marriage. That version disappeared the moment Adolfo opened the folder to the last section, the one with a page with the heading written in red. Damian explained that while they were investigating Marcelo, they found something they didn't understand at first. Money movements that didn't correspond to the pattern they already knew. They weren't Norma's gradual withdrawals emptying our accounts. They were deposits, money that was coming into an account they hadn't seen before, an account that wasn't in Norma's or Marcelo's name. It was in the name of a company, a small company registered 3 years ago that on paper was dedicated to personal image consulting, with no registered employees. No verifiable physical office, no public clients, the kind of company that exists on paper, but not in reality, the kind of company that is created to move money from one place to another without it looking like what it is. It took Damian 2 weeks to connect that company to Norma. He did it through a small, almost invisible detail. The company's contact email, which appeared in a public registry, had a combination of numbers at the end that Damian recognized. It was Norma's birthday written backwards, the kind of detail that only someone who knows the person well and is looking very carefully would notice. The company belonged to Norma and had been receiving money for 3 years. Not from our accounts, from another source. Adolfo looked at me when they got to that part of the story. He was looking for some sign in my face that I already knew something. He didn't find any because I knew nothing, absolutely nothing. And that was exactly what had disturbed them the most when they discovered it. Where was that money coming from? I asked. Damian took a deep breath. From a company where you work, Dad. The world stopped. Not figuratively. I literally felt something inside me completely freeze. My heart, my thoughts, the air in my lungs, everything still for a second that seemed much longer. What? I said, and my own voice sounded distant to me. We found periodic transfers from an account linked to suppliers of your company to the account of that ghost company of Mom's, Damian said. He spoke slowly, choosing each word carefully, like someone who knows that what they're saying can break something that can't be repaired. They're not huge amounts individually, but they're constant every month for 3 years, and they add up to a lot. I got up from the bed, walked to the window, looked outside without seeing anything. My company, the business I had built for 15 years. Distribution of construction materials, something I started from scratch with a loan that took me 6 years to pay off, and that with hard work and sacrifice I had turned into something stable, something that provided jobs for 19 people and was the support of everything we had. Someone was stealing from there, and that money was going into an account of Norma's. Does Norma have access to the company's accounts? Adolfo asked from the bed. No, I said. I never wanted to mix personal finances with the businesses. I always kept them separate. Then it wasn't her who took it out directly, Damian said. Someone from the inside was passing it to her. I turned to look at him. Someone from the inside, he nodded. That's what we haven't been able to fully confirm yet. We know where the money is coming from within the company. We know where it's going, but we don't know yet who is making the move from the inside. I sat down in the armchair in the corner because my legs wouldn't hold me up well anymore. Someone in my company, someone I hired, someone I paid, someone I possibly considered trustworthy, was taking money and sending it to my wife. And my wife was receiving it in a shell company that I didn't know existed. While living in my house, while sleeping in my bed, while saying good night to me and asking me how my day had been. 3 years. All of this had been going on for 3 years. Adolfo came over and sat on the arm of the chair next to me. He didn't say anything. He just was there. And that simple gesture, that being present without words, held me up more than anything he could have said. Damian continued. There's one person in the company we think is involved. He said, we can't prove it yet with what we have. But the pattern of the movements matches someone who has access to the supplier accounts and who has been working with you for exactly 3 years. 3 years. The same amount of time the shell company had been active. Who? I asked. Damian hesitated for a moment, not out of fear, but because he knew that the name he was about to say was going to hurt me in a different way than everything before. Not the pain of a wife's betrayal, but something closer to that particular feeling you get when you discover that someone you gave a chance to, someone you helped, someone you treated well, paid you back in the exact opposite way. Hernan, he said. I froze. Hernan, 38 years old, accountant, had been with the company for exactly 3 years. I had hired him after the previous accountant retired. Hernan came with good references, with a degree, with an orderly and discreet way of working that I had appreciated from the beginning. He wasn't the type of employee who gets noticed. He did his job. He arrived on time. He didn't create conflicts. The perfect type to steal without anyone looking. How did you get to him? I asked. By the time of the transfers, Damian said. They all happened between 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, from Monday to Wednesday. Those are the hours when Hernan works alone in the accounts area, because the other 2 on the team have fixed meetings on those days. We cross-referenced it with the internal calendar we managed to review. My 18-year-old sons had done what I hadn't done in 3 years. They had looked, they had paid attention, they had connected dots that I didn't even know existed. Does the lawyer know this? I asked. Yes, Damian said. We passed all the information to him last week. He's preparing two things in parallel. A formal complaint for financial fraud against Hernan and a civil action to recover the illegally transferred funds, including those from the university account. I looked at my sons. I really looked at them, perhaps as I hadn't looked at them in a long time. With that full attention that the routine and fatigue of daily life steal from you without you realizing it. I saw two young men who had taken a situation that would have destroyed any adult and had turned it into a file, a plan, a series of concrete steps aimed at recovering what was ours, without losing their heads, without acting on impulse, without letting the pain paralyze them. Why didn't you tell me anything before? I asked, not with reproach, with a genuine need to understand. Adolfo answered, because if we had told you before we had everything ready, you would have confronted Mom, and if you had confronted her, she would have left anyway, but without the track transfers. Without the documented shell company, without anything we could use legally. She would have left with the money, and there would be no way to trace it. He was right. I would have done exactly that. I would have confronted Norma the moment I found out. I would have told her everything I knew, and she would have accelerated her plan and disappeared before we could do anything. My sons had protected me from myself. The lawyer needs to meet with you today, Damian said. There are documents you need to sign for the legal actions to move forward. And there's something else you need to know before that meeting. What else? I said, and I was almost afraid to ask. Damian and Adolfo looked at each other again. That silent communication between them that I'd seen all their lives, and that had always seemed to me one of the most extraordinary things about having twin sons. That language without words that only the two of them understood. Marcelo isn't alone in this, Adolfo said. He finally has a partner, someone who helps him identify the women he's going to use, someone who is closer than Mom imagines. The silence that followed was dense and cold. Closer how? I asked. Someone who knew her, Damian said. Someone who gave him information about our family, about our accounts, about how much we had saved. I felt a chill run down my spine. That changed everything. It meant that Norma hadn't just been an unfaithful wife who made bad decisions. Norma had been selected, identified, studied, and someone who knew us had facilitated all of that. Who? I asked. Damian opened the folder to the last page. He passed me a printed photograph. I looked at it and the air left my lungs for the second time in less than 24 hours. The photograph was of Bernardo, Norma's brother, 44 years old, the younger of the two. The one who had always been the family favorite, the one who never finished anything he started, the one who jumped from job to job for years because he was my brother-in-law, and because Norma asked me in her way of asking for things that didn't leave much room for no. Got him a stable position with one of my main suppliers, Bernardo, whom I had helped, whom I had personally recommended, whom I had defended in front of my own partner when he told me he didn't trust him. Bernardo was the link between Marcelo and Norma. I just stared at the photograph without being able to say anything for a time I couldn't measure. It was an image taken from a distance with the zoom of Adolfo's phone. Grainy, but clear enough. Bernardo sitting in a cafe with Marcelo, both leaning over the table, talking with the closeness of people who share secrets. A conversation that, from the body language, was neither casual nor recent. It was the conversation of two people who know each other well and are coordinating something. The date in the corner of the photograph said 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks before Norma emptied the accounts and disappeared. Adolfo explained how they got to him. At the end of March, while tracking the money movements to Norma's shell company, Damian noticed that several of the amounts coincided with dates when Bernardo had visited our house. Not all the visits, but enough to establish a pattern. Bernardo would arrive, spend a few hours, and 1 or 2 days later, there would be a transfer to the shell account, as if each visit were a report, an update of information. Adolfo started following him, not physically at first. On social media, Bernardo wasn't careful with his online activity. He used the same platforms with the same name. He followed accounts that connected him to Marcelo through 2 or 3 steps and had commented on posts from a company that turned out to be linked to the same circle of irregular businesses as Marcelo. Bernardo's world and Marcelo's world were not parallel. They intersected, and that intersection was neither recent nor accidental. Damian investigated deeper. He found that Bernardo and Marcelo had met 4 years ago at a business event in another city. He confirmed this through a list of attendees that was published on the website of the organization that had sponsored the event. The 2 names there on the same page. For years of knowing each other. 1 year before Marcelo started appearing on Norma's phone. The plan had taken 4 years to execute. For years since Bernardo presented the target to Marcelo. For years since Marcelo began to build his approach strategy. A year of careful courtship, of calculated messages, of promises designed specifically for someone Bernardo had described to him in detail. Her dissatisfactions, her dreams, her fears, her weak points. Her own brother had sold her out. I had to get up again. I couldn't be still with that information inside me. I paced from one end of the room to the other, while my sons watched me in silence, letting me process without rushing me, without saying anything that wasn't necessary. Bernardo knew how much money we had. He knew because Norma told him, because siblings talk, because things were mentioned at family gatherings, because I myself at some Christmas or birthday dinner had commented without thinking about the consequences that the business was going well, that the savings were growing, that the boy's future was secure. Words said without malice, received with a very different purpose. Bernardo gave Marcelo the complete map of our family. How much we had, where it was kept, how the finances worked, who managed them, what the dynamic was between Norma and me, everything Marcelo needed to design a custom-made trap, and Norma never knew. That was the most twisted part of it all. Norma thought she was making a free choice, that she was falling in love, that she was choosing a new life, that she was escaping to something better. She didn't know that every step she took had been calculated by someone who had known her since she was a child and who had used her as an instrument to rob her own family. How much did they pay Bernardo? My sons had investigated that too, not with exactitude, but with enough evidence to suspect. There were deposits in Bernardo's account that didn't correspond to his salary or any verifiable source of income. Moderate amounts, nothing scandalous, but regular, the kind of payment that is made when someone provides a continuous service. His service was his own sister. I put that photograph away, I put it in the drawer of my nightstand, and I closed the drawer with more force than necessary. Damian noticed, but said nothing. Adolfo didn't either. They gave me the space I needed to swallow that anger and turn it into something that could be useful instead of something that would destroy me. The lawyer knows all this too, I said, not as a question. Yes, Damian said. All the information about Bernardo is documented and in the lawyer's hands for 2 weeks now. It's being included in the complaint. I nodded slowly. And does Norma know that Bernardo used her? No, Adolfo said. She still thinks her brother is her accomplice, that he helped her plan all this. She doesn't know that he was the one who got her into this from the beginning. She doesn't know that Marcelo sought her out because Bernardo pointed her out to him. I closed my eyes for a moment. That revelation, when it came, was going to be devastating for Norma. As furious as I was with her, as much damage as she had done to me, there was something in imagining that moment that didn't give me satisfaction. It gave me a strange and heavy sadness. Because Norma, at the bottom of all this, was also a victim. A victim who had made terrible decisions, who had betrayed her family, who had stolen her own children's future, but a victim nonetheless, although that didn't change anything she had done. It didn't change the 240,000 pesos from the university account. It didn't change the 3 years of Hernan stealing from my company with her complicity. It didn't change the lies, the nights in the dark writing to Marcelo, the different soap, the calculated silences. None of that disappeared because she didn't know the whole truth either. Damian told me that the meeting with the lawyer was scheduled for 11 in the morning. There were 2 hours left. I needed a shower, get dressed, eat something even if I wasn't hungry. and get to that meeting with my head as clear as possible, because what I signed that day was going to determine a lot of what happened next. I got up with that intention, but before leaving the room, I stopped at the door and looked at the two of them, sitting on my bed with a folder between them. With the seriousness of men who had had to grow up suddenly without anyone asking them to. "Are you two okay?" I asked them. I didn't mean if they were physically okay. I meant the other thing, the weight of having carried that secret for so long, the cost of discovering that your mother is not who you thought she was, the silent damage of knowing something that hurts and not being able to say it. Adolfo looked at me, and for the first time since all this had begun, I saw something in his face that was not calm or strategy. It was just a second in which the 18-year-old boy appeared behind the man he was becoming. "We'll be better when this is over," he said. I nodded. I went to shower. While the hot water ran over my head, I tried to sort out everything I knew. Norma, Marcelo, Bernardo, Hernan. For people connected in a web of betrayal that had been operating in silence around my life for years. For people who had bet that I wasn't looking, that I wasn't asking, that I trusted too much and verified too little. They had bet right. But they hadn't counted on my sons. And at 11 that morning, sitting in front of a lawyer who knew every detail of what my sons had built for 4 months, I began to understand that the plan Damian and Adolfo had designed was not just a response to the betrayal. It was a work of precision, every piece in its place, every step thought out for the next. A structure that had been built while the betrayal was still advancing, without interfering with it, without alerting it, letting it get exactly where it needed to go for the counterpunch to be complete. The lawyer spread the documents on the table. I looked at them. I read them carefully, something I hadn't done with anything for a long time because I had gotten used to trusting without verifying. I signed where I had to sign, and when I finished, the lawyer told me something my sons already knew, but that I heard for the first time that day. The plan had 3 simultaneous fronts. The first was legal, the complaints, the documents, the freezing of assets that had been in motion for days, silently, without Norma or Marcelo or Bernardo or Hernan knowing yet. The second was financial, a series of moves the lawyer had coordinated with the advice of a trusted accountant to protect what was left of the family and company assets before the legal processes became public. And the third was the most delicate. The third was Marcelo. Because Marcelo had a problem he didn't know he had yet. A problem my sons had discovered almost by accident 3 weeks ago, and that had completely changed the scope of what they could do. Marcelo hadn't only done this with Norma. There was an open case in another city. A complaint filed by a previous woman. An investigation that had been advancing in silence for months and was about to reach a critical stage. An investigation that needed exactly the kind of documentation my sons had compiled for 4 months, and that woman's lawyer had been in contact with ours for 2 weeks. Everything was coming together at the same time, and Norma, in that rented apartment 4 hours away, still knew nothing about anything. She still thought she had one. I left the meeting with the lawyer at 1:30 in the afternoon. The sun was beating down on the sidewalk, and I stood for a moment in front of the building with the signed documents in an envelope and that strange feeling of someone who has just activated something that can't be reversed. Like dropping a stone from a great height. You can't catch it anymore. You can only see where it falls. Damian and Adolfo were waiting for me in the car, both in the back seat, both with their phones in their hands, both looking up at the same time when I opened the driver's door. That synchronicity of theirs that never ceased to amaze me, as if they shared an internal clock that the rest of the world couldn't hear. "How is it?" Damian asked. "I signed everything." I said, "The lawyer says the legal processes will start moving this week. Complaint against Hernan. Civil action to recover funds and the connection with the case in the other city." Adolfo nodded slowly. "Good, because something happened this morning." I looked at him in the rearview mirror. "What happened?" "Marcelo posted a photo on social media," he said, "from the city where they are. A restaurant. He looks happy." He paused briefly. "Mom doesn't appear in the photo, but the location is tagged." I was silent for a moment. "Why would he do that?" I asked. "If they're trying to disappear, posting their location is a huge mistake." Exactly, Damian said. And Marcelo isn't stupid, which means he doesn't care if he's found, which means he doesn't plan to stay there long. I looked at him again. How long do you think he plans to stay with her? Damian stared at his phone for a moment before answering. The pattern with the previous women says that between 3 and 6 weeks after the escape, Marcelo disappears, takes what he can take, and leaves the woman alone, without money, without contacts, in a place that isn't hers. My stomach tightened, not for Norma, or not just for Norma, but because at that moment I understood that time mattered, that if Marcelo followed his pattern, at some point in the next few weeks, he was going to drop Norma like you drop something that's no longer useful. And Norma was going to be left alone in a strange city, without the money she thought she had, without the man she thought loved her, without anything. And at that moment she was going to call. I knew it before it happened. I felt it with that strange certainty that sometimes comes with knowing a person for 20 years. Norma, when she fell, was going to call me, not for love, not for true remorse, but because when everything collapses, people call the place they know, the place they feel safe, even if they've destroyed it. That's how fear works. I started the car. I drove in silence for a while. The city streets passed by outside, as always, with their normal noise, with their normal people, with that indifference that daily life has towards each person's particular dramas. No one on those sidewalks knew what was happening in that car. No one knew that a 45-year-old man was driving with his 2 twin sons after discovering that his marriage had been a lie built in layers over years. That's how it is. The biggest things that happen to you always happen in the most ordinary spaces. There's something I haven't asked you yet, I said when we stopped at a traffic light. What? Adolfo said. Does Hernan know he's been discovered? No, Damian said. Nobody knows anything yet. Hernan is still coming to work every morning as if nothing's wrong. The lawyer recommended not to alert him until the complaint is formally filed, so he doesn't have time to erase evidence, and he's still making transfers. The last one was 4 days ago, Damian said. But there's something interesting. Since Mom left, the amount has gone down, as if he's also waiting to see what happens. As if he knows something has changed, but he doesn't know exactly what. That told me Hernan was scared. Fear makes people make mistakes, and mistakes leave traces. The lawyer knew that too. That's why he had recommended waiting a few more days before filing the formal complaint, to give Hernan enough rope to get tangled up on his own. We got home. We went inside in silence. The house had that particular quietness of spaces that have just lost someone. Not a quietness of peace, a quietness of absence. Of a place that doesn't yet know what it is without the person who is no longer there. I sat in the living room. Damian went to the kitchen to heat up something to eat because none of the 3 of us had had a proper lunch. Adolfo sat in front of me with that expression of having something more to say, but choosing the moment. Say it, I told him. He smiled slightly. Am I that obvious? You've had that face for half an hour. Adolfo rested his elbows on his knees. I spoke with a lawyer from the case in the other city this morning, the one for the case against Marcelo. I looked at him attentively. They need a testimony, not from you, from someone who can confirm Marcelo's pattern of behavior with previous victims and connect it to the current case. Someone who has documentation of the process he followed with Mom from the beginning. Us, I said. Damian and I, Adolfo said. We have everything documented. The dates, the amounts, the track conversations, the complete timeline. The lawyer says it's exactly the kind of evidence they need for the case to move forward more solidly. I was silent for a moment. Are you willing to do that? We already said yes. Adolfo said simply, like someone saying they've already confirmed a doctor's appointment without drama, without heroism, without expecting me to tell him he was brave, just a fact. Damian came back from the kitchen with 3 plates. We ate in the living room, the 3 of us together, with the TV off and the conversation flowing in a low voice towards the practical details of the following days. What documents to bring, when to meet with the lawyer from the other case, how to manage the company while Hernan's situation was being resolved legally. I listened and participated, but a part of my head was somewhere else. I was thinking about the next few days, about what it was going to be like to go to work knowing Hernan was there, to look him in the eyes knowing what I knew, to talk to him normally, while underneath, everything was moving towards the moment when reality would catch up with him. That was going to require a performance I didn't know I had in me. It wasn't my nature. I was always direct. When something bothered me, I said it. When something was wrong, I confronted it. My sons had had to learn to do the opposite for 4 months, to act normally while inside they were building something, to smile at the table while carrying a huge weight, to be patient when everything in them wanted to react. I wondered how much of that weight they still carried. I wondered if they would ever be able to really talk about what they had felt during those months, about what it meant to discover that their mother was capable of that, about the silent grief of seeing someone you've loved since you were born become someone you don't recognize. That would come later. When all this was over, we would have time for that. For now, there was work to be done. The following Wednesday, 5 days after Norma left, Hernan arrived at the company as always, punctual, discreet, with his cup of coffee and his folder under his arm. I arrived 10 minutes later. I greeted him in the hallway with the same normalcy as always. He returned the greeting with the same discretion as always. Neither of us knew that this was his last normal Wednesday, because that afternoon at 5 the lawyer formally filed the complaint. And that same night, while Hernan was having a quiet dinner at home without knowing what was coming, while Bernardo was sleeping without knowing his name was in a file, while Marcelo was promising Norma a future that he would never fulfill, something began to move in silence, like water that starts to seep through a crack slowly at first, almost imperceptible, but unstoppable. Thursday dawned cloudy. I remember that detail because I stood for a moment at the kitchen window looking at the gray sky before making my coffee, and I thought that the weather has a strange way of coinciding with what you feel inside. Not always, but sometimes yes. That Thursday, yes. Damian came down first, poured himself coffee without saying anything, and sat in front of me at the kitchen counter with his phone face down on the surface, which in him meant he wanted to talk without distractions. I learned to read those small gestures over the years. My sons had their own language of signs that I had been deciphering without them knowing. The lawyer called late last night. He said, after you went to bed. What did he say? The complaint against Hernan was admitted. They're going to notify him formally this morning. He paused. And there's something else. The judge handling the case in the other city, Marcelo's, received the documentation we sent yesterday. The lawyer there says it was exactly what they needed to request a precautionary measure. What does that mean in practical terms? I asked. It means they can block Marcelo's money movements while the process moves forward, Damian said. The accounts we identified, the ones linked to him directly, are going to be frozen in the next 48 hours if the judge approves the measure. I was processing that in silence. 48 hours. Marcelo was going to wake up at some point that weekend and discover that he couldn't move the money that Norma had brought him, my children's money, the money from 11 years of overtime and giving things up and sacrifices. He was going to try to transfer it or withdraw it or do whatever he had planned to do with it, and he wouldn't be able to. And at that moment, he was going to understand that something had gone very wrong. Adolfo came down 20 minutes later. The three of us had breakfast together with that mix of tension and calm that we had developed during that week like athletes before an important competition. The body still, the mind active, the silence productive. I went to the company. Arriving that Thursday and seeing Hernan at his desk was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. Not because I was afraid of him, but because the anger I felt was the kind that burns inside and that you have to contain with enormous force so it doesn't show on your face. Hernan looked up when I passed his office and greeted me with a nod. I returned the gesture with the same normalcy as always. Inside me something roared. 3 years. 3 years coming to work every morning without knowing that that man sitting in that chair with that cup of coffee and that neat folder was robbing me. Without drama. Without hurry, with the methodical patience of someone who knows that small and constant thefts are harder to detect than large and obvious ones. I locked myself in my office. At 10, 15 in the morning, I heard a different movement in the hallway. Voices that weren't the usual ones. Footsteps that weren't my employees. I got up and opened the door carefully. Two men I didn't know were walking towards Hernan's office. Dark suits, folders. That particular air of someone who arrives with legal authority and doesn't need to announce themselves with a fuss because formality is already enough weight. Hernan saw them approaching. I watched him from the distance of my door. I saw the exact moment his face changed. It was quick, very quick. A fraction of a second where the organized and discreet man disappeared, and what was left was something different, something that looked like fear mixed with the accelerated calculation of someone trying in tenths of a second to evaluate how much they know, what they can prove, how much time he has. The answer to all three questions was the same. Everything, none. I closed my office door. I sat down. I breathed. I didn't feel satisfaction at that moment. That surprised me. I thought I would. I thought seeing Hernan face the consequences of what he had done would give me some kind of relief. But what I felt was something more complex, a mix of exhaustion and sadness. Of that particular feeling you get when something that has been broken for a long time finally starts to get fixed. But the process of fixing it also hurts. At 12, I called the lawyer. He confirmed what I already knew. Hernan had been notified. His personal accounts had been preventively blocked while the process moved forward. He had a deadline to appear with legal representation. The lawyer told me the evidence was solid, that the case was clear, and that the chances of recovering a significant part of what was stolen were real, although the process would take time. Everything took time. That afternoon, on the way home, Damian called me on the phone while I was driving. "Dad, there's news. Tell me." The judge approved the precautionary measure. Marcelo's accounts have been frozen for 2 hours. I took a deep breath. "How do you know so quickly?" The lawyer from the other case notified us immediately. Damian said. "She says Marcelo already tried to make a transfer this afternoon, and it was rejected. They know because the bank is required to report movement attempts on accounts under a precautionary measure. Try to move it. He had already tried to move it. What that meant was that Marcelo knew something was up. Maybe not what exactly, maybe not the full scope, but he knew his accounts were blocked, and that was enough for a man like him to start calculating his options, and his options were few. Does Norma know anything about this?" I asked. "We don't think so," Damian said. "But if Marcelo panics, she's going to be the first to notice." I got home. Adolfo was in the living room with the computer open. He looked up when I came in, and I saw something in his face that I hadn't seen in days. A different tension, not the controlled tension of someone executing a plan. The tension of someone waiting for something they know is going to happen, but they don't know exactly when. "There's something I need to show you," he said. I sat next to him. On the screen was a screenshot of Marcelo's social media account, public, visible to anyone. The photo from the restaurant they had seen days ago was gone. It had been deleted, and in the last few hours there had been no new activity. For someone who posted regularly, that sudden silence was in itself a sign. Marcelo was erasing his digital traces. "He's preparing something," I said. "He's preparing an exit," Adolfo said. "When a man like him can't move money through normal channels, he looks for another way. Or he looks for someone to lend him money, or he looks to liquidate something physically, or he just disappears and leaves everything behind, including Norma." Adolfo looked at me, especially Norma. The silence that followed was heavy and dense. I thought of Norma in that rented apartment, not knowing that Marcelo's accounts were frozen, not knowing that there was an open investigation in another city, not knowing that her brother had been included in a formal complaint, not knowing that Hernan had been notified that morning, not knowing anything about anything that had been building up in silence while she thought she had escaped to a new life. She thought she had one. At this moment, she still thought so. That night, the three of us had dinner together again. Not much, because none of us had much of an appetite. The conversation was practical about the next steps, about the timelines of the legal process, about how to manage the company in the coming days while Hernan's situation was formally resolved. But at some point during dinner, Adolfo said something that stuck with me. He said, almost out of the blue, looking at his plate. Do you think she knows deep down that something is wrong? No one answered immediately. I thought about it for a moment. I thought of the Norma I knew, of her intelligence for numbers, for patterns, for reading situations. And I thought that, yes, that somewhere underneath the illusion and the promises and the plans she thought she had executed perfectly, there was a part of her that probably already felt that the air had changed, that something didn't smell right, that the calm was too calm. She's going to find out for sure soon, I said. And I was right, because the next day, Friday morning, while I was at the company reviewing the month's reports and trying to maintain the operational normalcy of a business that was still running, even though everything else was in the process of being rebuilt, Damian sent me a 2-word message, 2 words that changed everything, that marked the beginning of the end of this story. The message said, "She knows." I read the message 3 times. She knows. I put the phone in my pocket and stared at the reports on my desk without seeing anything. The columns of numbers, the dates, the client names. Everything became blurry for a moment, because those 2 words meant that something had changed on the other side, that reality had reached Norma in some way, that the bubble she had been living in since she walked out that door on Tuesday morning with her suitcase and her children's money had started to burst. I left my office. I passed by the desk where Ernan used to sit, now empty, with the chair tucked in with too much precision, as if someone had wanted to erase any trace of human presence. And I felt something I didn't expect to feel in front of that empty desk. Not relief, but the weight of everything that space represented. 3 years of misplaced trust. 3 years of coming in every morning without knowing what was happening meters away from me. I called Damian from the parking lot. He answered on the second ring. "Did you see the message?" "Yes." "What happened?" "How do you know she knows?" "Because Marcelo told her something this morning," Damian said. Not everything, but enough for her to start asking questions he didn't want to answer. Adolfo was monitoring her social media activity and detected that Mom's secondary account, the one she used to talk to Marcelo, had unusual activity since early morning. Short, frequent messages, the kind of pattern that indicates an argument. An argument about what? "About the money," he said. "We think Marcelo told her there was a problem with the accounts, that he couldn't access the funds, and when Mom asked why, he didn't have an answer that convinced her." My stomach tensed. And Marcelo. Since 10 this morning, there's been no activity on any of his social media accounts. His phone is still active according to the tracking from the lawyer in the other case, but it's been on airplane mode intermittently, like someone who wants to be available for certain things, but invisible for others. That was the sign. Marcelo was evaluating when to let go, when to just disappear and leave Norma with the weight of everything, without any of the promises he had made her. It's what he always did. It was the pattern Damian had identified months ago, and now that pattern was activating in real time. "How much time do you think she has before he disappears?" I asked. Damian took a second. "The lawyer from the other case says that in similar cases the abandonment occurs between 12 and 36 hours after the accounts are blocked. It's been almost 20 hours since the freeze." I did the quick calculation. Between now and tomorrow morning. I went back to the office. I tried to work. I couldn't really, but I tried because I needed the hours to pass, and there was no other way to make them pass than to keep moving. At 2 in the afternoon, I ate something without knowing what it was. At 4, I checked my phone 20 times in an hour. At 6, I left for home. That night was the longest. The 3 of us were in the living room after dinner when Adolfo's phone vibrated. He picked it up, looked at it, and looked up at me with an expression that needed no words. "What?" I said. "Mom's account activity stopped 2 hours ago," Adolfo said. The last time Marcelo replied to a message was at 5:30 in the afternoon. Since then, total silence from him. The clock on the wall read 9:40. For hours of silence. Damian was on the couch with the computer. Without looking up, he said, "His phone has been on airplane mode for 3 hours. The lawyer just messaged me. Marcelo isn't at the rented apartment. The landlord confirmed it, because he went to check at the court's request. The keys were in the door from the inside. He left through the back window. Through the back window. That fast, that calculated, that cold. Marcelo had disappeared and had left Norma in that apartment with the money frozen, without access to anything, in a city that wasn't hers, with the story of her new life collapsing in real time. I froze on the sofa. I thought of her at that moment, alone in that apartment, looking at her phone, calling Marcelo, and hearing the silence of the turned-off phone, slowly understanding. With that painful slowness with which one understands things one doesn't want to understand, that the man who promised her a new life had used her and had let her go without looking back. And then I thought, now she's going to call me. I thought it, and I pushed it away. I told myself it was too soon, that maybe she would call Bernardo first, that maybe she would try to solve something on her own before making that call, that her pride, which was always considerable, would take a while to give in. I was wrong. At 10:17 that night, my phone rang. Unknown number, but from the right city. The three of us looked at each other. Damian and Adolfo were completely still. The TV was on with no volume. The light from the screen flickered silently on the walls. Everything in that room stopped at that exact moment. I answered, Eliseo. Norma's voice, but different, without her usual confidence, without that controlled modulation she used when she wanted to seem serene. It was a voice broken at the edges, the voice of someone who has been crying and is trying not to while talking. Yes, I said, a single word, without warmth or coldness, just confirmation of presence. Eliseo, I need you to listen to me. Short pause. I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I know, but I'm in a very difficult situation and I don't know who else to call. I was silent. Are you there? She said, I'm here. I heard her breathing irregularly, trying to order her words, that underneath that voice there was something that resembled panic, but that was still trying to disguise itself as composure. Marcelo left, she said finally. He left, and I don't know where he is. His phone doesn't answer, his things are gone, and the accounts are blocked. I can't access anything. I don't understand what happened. I thought she broke off. Eliseo, I don't have money for the hotel. I don't have a way to get back. I need help. The silence that followed was mine. My sons were looking at me. Damian with his arms crossed. Adolfo with his hands clasped on his knees. Both still, both attentive, both leaving me the space to respond as I chose. I breathed. Norma, I said calmly, do you know why those accounts are blocked? Pause. No, she said. I don't know. Marcelo didn't explain anything to me before they're blocked. I interrupted her with the same calmness. Because there's a precautionary measure issued by a court. Because there's an open investigation for financial fraud in which Marcelo's name appears along with yours in several documents. Silence on the other end. A different silence. The silence of someone who has just received information they didn't expect and is processing its implications at full speed. What? She said, her voice smaller now. The money from our son's university accounts. I continued. The 380,000 pesos you were taking out for months. The shell company in your name. The transfers from my company that you coordinated with Hernan. Brief pause. Everything is documented, Norma. Everything has dates, amounts, destination accounts. Everything has been in the hands of a lawyer for days. The silence this time was longer. When she spoke again, her composure was completely gone. How? How do you know all that? Your sons, I said, and I felt something in my chest as I said it. Pride, a huge and clean pride. The sons whose future you stole. They investigated it, they documented it. They put everything in the hands of a lawyer while you thought no one was watching. I heard something on the other end that could have been a contained sob, or perhaps the sound of something breaking inside a person when reality finally catches up with them with no escape. Eliseo, she began and didn't finish. Norma, I said, not cruelly, but without softness either. There's something else you need to know. Something about Bernardo. Pause. What about Bernardo? Bernardo has known Marcelo for 4 years. I said, he was the one who told him about you, who gave him information about our family, about our accounts, about how much we had. Marcelo didn't find you by chance. He looked for you because your own brother directed him to you. The silence that followed was the most absolute silence I heard in this whole story. More than the silence of the night, I found the empty account. More than the silence of sleepless early mornings. More than any other. It was the silence of a woman on whom the entire world had just fallen at once. "That can't be true," she said finally, almost in a whisper. "We have the documentation," I said. "The meetings between them, the dates, the payments Bernardo received, everything." Another silence, and then Norma cried. Not the contained crying from before. She really cried with that sound that crying has when there's nothing left to protect and nothing to pretend. When a person truly hits rock bottom and no longer cares who is listening. I didn't say anything. I let her cry. My sons were still motionless in the living room. Damian was looking at the floor. Adolfo was looking at the window. Both in silence, letting that moment be what it had to be. Finally, Norma's voice returned, broken, almost unrecognizable. "What am I going to do?" she said, and I answered with the only truth I had to give her that. I said slowly, "Is no longer up to me." I hung up the phone. I put on the coffee table carefully, as if it were something fragile, although what was fragile was not the phone, but the air that was left in that room after that call. A dense, charged air, full of everything that had just been said and everything that could never be unsaid. My sons didn't say anything immediately. Adolfo was still looking at the window. Damian was still looking at the floor, both processing in silence, each in their own way, what they had just heard. Because they had heard everything too, not just my words, but also their mother's broken voice on the other end of the phone. Also that final cry that had nothing of an act. It was Adolfo who spoke first. "How are you?" he asked me. He didn't ask what she had said. He didn't ask what happened now with the legal process. He didn't ask me anything practical. He asked me how I was, with that direct simplicity that people have, who know that sometimes the only important question is the simplest one. I really thought about it before answering. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "Ask me tomorrow." He nodded. That was enough for him. Damian looked up from the floor. "What you said about Bernardo, that you told her. She had to know." I said, "Yes." Damian said, without judging whether it had been the right decision or not, just confirming that he understood the reason. I got up from the sofa. I went to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water. I drank it slowly, standing in front of the sink, looking at the blurry reflection of the dark window. Outside, the night was still the same as always, the same streets, the same streetlights, the same dog that sometimes barked in the distance. The world completely indifferent, as always, to what had just changed inside this house. I thought of Norma in that apartment, alone, with no accessible money, without Marcelo, without the plan she had built for months, with the revelation of Bernardo still echoing in her head like something that hasn't quite settled because it's too big to process in one go. I didn't feel satisfaction. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to say that I did, that I felt justice, that I felt the world had been balanced. But what I felt was more complicated than that. I felt the enormous exhaustion of someone who has carried too much in a very short time. I felt the particular sadness of when something that was real for years ends definitively. I felt the weight of knowing that two 18-year-old boys had had to become adults ahead of time to save what their mother had tried to destroy. That's not satisfaction. That's the real cost of betrayals, the cost that no one mentions. I went back to the living room. They were both still there, and at that moment, without planning it, without anyone saying it, the three of us ended up sitting together on the same sofa. Adolfo on my right, Damian on my left. Like when they were little and there was a storm and they would get between Norma and me in bed without asking for permission, because the storm was enough justification to need to be close. Now there was no storm outside, but there was inside, and being close was still the only answer that made sense. We didn't say much more that night. We didn't have to. There were things that words can't cover and that are better left in silence until time gives them the right shape. We stayed like that for a while. The three of us with the TV still on, without volume, until one by one we went up to sleep. I slept that night for the first time since all this had begun. I really slept, not well, not deeply, not without interruptions, but I slept, and that alone was something. The days that followed were a mix of slow movements and rapid impacts. The following Monday, Bernardo was notified of his inclusion in the complaint. According to what the lawyer told me later, Bernardo's reaction to receiving the notification was to immediately call Norma. That call, according to what Norma told the lawyer days later, when she began to cooperate with the process, was the worst conversation of her life because Bernardo didn't deny anything. He tried to justify himself. He tried to explain. He tried to build some narrative that would make him seem less than what he was. And Norma, who had always been intelligent, who had always known how to read people, even if she hadn't always used that intelligence well, understood in that call that everything I had told her that night was true. Her brother had sold her out. That betrayal, paradoxically, was what finally moved Norma towards cooperation with the legal process. Not remorse towards me. Not guilt for her sons, although that also came later, but Bernardo's betrayal, because there's a particular kind of pain that comes from discovering that someone from your own blood used you as an instrument. A pain different from all the others, deeper, harder to process. Norma returned to the city 10 days after she had left. Not to our house, to a friend's house. I didn't see her in those first weeks. It wasn't the time. The lawyer handled everything that had to be handled between us, and that was enough for now. Hernan reached an agreement with the prosecutor's office 3 weeks later. He returned what he could, signed what he had to sign, and faced the consequences of 3 years of decisions he thought no one would see. The process of recovering the funds from the company was going to take time, but the lawyer was optimistic. Marcelo was located 2 weeks after his disappearance. He was in another city with another name, starting what seemed to be the same pattern with another woman. The joint investigation between the case in the other city and ours was enough to stop him. I'm not going to go into legal details because there are still open cases, but he's facing charges, several. And this time he's not going to be able to drop everything and disappear like he had done before. Bernardo lost his job. He lost several other things. The consequences of what he did are going to follow him for a long time. And I was rebuilding, not all at once, not in a linear way, not without bad days, without difficult nights, without moments when the weight of everything that had happened would suddenly arrive without warning and crush you even if you thought you had already processed it. That's how it is. Reconstruction is not a straight line. It's more like a spiral. Sometimes you go up, sometimes you go down, but if you look at the whole thing from a distance, you see that the general trend is upwards. What had changed definitively was the way I look at things. I never again trusted without verifying. I never again left the finances completely in the hands of another person without reviewing them myself. I never again ignored the small signs because it suited me not to see them, not because I became distrustful in a sickly way, but because I learned that blind trust is not a virtue. It's a vulnerability disguised as love. My sons went ahead with their university plans. It took months to partially recover the money, but between what the legal process returned and some adjustments we made in the company, they were both able to enroll in their careers. Damian chose law. No one was surprised. Adolfo chose psychology. That did surprise me a little until I thought about it, and it stopped surprising me completely. One Sunday those months later, the three of us went out for breakfast. A simple place near the house. One of those with tables on the sidewalk and coffee served in thick ceramic mugs, and the noise of the street mixes with the conversations, and everything has that particular texture of the ordinary that is no longer taken for granted. We were waiting for our plates when Adolfo said something I haven't forgotten. He said, looking at his coffee, "Do you know what was the hardest part of all this, Dad?" "What?" I said. "Not telling you anything for 4 months, seeing you every day and not being able to tell you anything." He looked up, not because we didn't want to, but because we wanted that when we told you, there would already be a way out. Not just the blow. I just stared at him. Damian nodded without saying anything, confirming that that was exactly what they had both felt. I had to look at the street for a moment so as not to show them the face I was making. That kind of emotion that comes up suddenly and that doesn't have an exact name, but that has to do with love and with pride and with gratitude and with the awareness of having been luckier than I deserve to have the sons I have. When I looked at them again, I only said one thing. "Thank you." Just that, but I said it in the way you say things that don't fit into longer words. Adolfo nodded. Damian smiled. That smile of his, small, controlled, the same as on the first day, only now I knew exactly what it meant. The plates arrived, we had breakfast together, and life went on. Different, more honest, lighter in some things and heavier in others. But it went on because that's how it is, because betrayals don't have to be the end of the story. They just have to be the moment when you decide what kind of story you want to tell from there. I chose this one.